Good morning. It's Sunday, August 7th, and I'm starting a new series right now on my channel where I'm actually going to discuss books that I'm recently reading and just kind of give you a report on them, let you know what I thought. It's one of those things where if you were kind of interested in it, maybe you can hear this and say, oh, now I definitely want to read it. Or you can hear what I have to say, and if it's too boring, be like, listen, I'm just going to skip that one and go on to something else on my shelf. If you happen to be like me at all, there's always things on your shelf that you own but haven't read yet. So to get through them as fast as possible isn't the goal just for speed. It's usually the goal saying, oh, I want that story. I can't wait to get to my next story, whatever that might be too. So this is going to be almost like a book discussion. I'm going to do this as often as I can finish a book, and we'll move on from there. And I got this idea recently. I was actually in the middle of finishing Anne Rice's saga, her Vampire Chronicles, which also brings in her Lives of the Mayfair Witches series later on, and it's like one big, almost 20 book series. So instead of doing every one individually, I'm going to give you one big saga blast right now for everything and move on from there. Okay? Let's get started. So to start out with, back in the 70s, Anne Rice had created her Vampire Chronicles universe with Interview with the Vampire. This is actually a very simple story where there's a vampire who gets a hold of a reporter, sits down, and has an interview talking about when he came into the blood, as they say, and just lived with other vampires for hundreds of years, or whatever the actual time frame might be. It kind of launched her career and launched everything that happened afterwards, like I said, over the course of the next 40, 50 years with all these novels. This novel actually was actually recreated with a movie starring Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise. I thought the movie was very good. You'll learn by listening to stories or reading on the internet that apparently there was a lot of strife behind the camera, and those two stars just did not like each other. One of the reasons why you never saw it happen for a sequel with them. Anne Rice apparently was very unhappy with Tom Cruise being cast, but I think he did a fantastic job. He brought the what was actually the kind of the villain of the story, Lestat, into good flesh and blood life, and it's a worthwhile watch. Just the same, the book is a worthwhile read. I do recommend this. Again, you have Louis, who's the vampire, sits down with a reporter, I believe his name is Daniel, and just kind of chronicles his life, and it takes a while before the reporter actually believes that he's a vampire. Before he gets out of the interview, it's all done, and he actually publishes it as a book. One of the interesting things on all of the books in this Vampire Chronicles saga is the fact that every book you read is actually a published in universe book as well. It makes it very interesting. So, Interview with the Vampire actually is published as a book in the Anne Rice universe and gets shelved in the fiction section. So even though Vampire came out and said, hey, listen, we exist, I'm one of them, I'll tell you all the things that happened to me, no one believes it. So it kind of assists them with the anonymity of living in society. You can even tell people what you're about to do, and no one believes what you're doing. Interestingly enough, decades later, so this book was written in the 70s, I think sometime around 2012, someone had the imaginative idea to come up with a graphic novel with which they told a similar story that Interview with the Vampire, but they called it Claudia's story. And Claudia's story actually takes place around the same time, like right in the middle of the story, with a young girl who was converted to a vampire when she's, like 7, 8, 9 years old. And because of that, she's not mature enough to do things that a full-fledged vampire would be able to do. Her story is pretty tragic. So someone came up with a graphic novel where they actually told the story from her point of view. So when she's a girl and meets these two men and becomes a vampire and how she learns things, and even though her body will never mature into adulthood, her mind still grows year after year, so therefore she's not taken seriously and she thinks she's rather incomplete. Graphic novel has some fantastic art in it. I highly suggest you actually get a chance to read this. They actually did all the art the inks and the colors in these forms of sepia tones, so it actually looks kind of muted and almost has like a period feel to it. But the best part about that is when there actually is like a blood event, they get out the red ink, and you can see that the blood is everywhere, and it just pops on that background of color. Perfect idea. I applaud the people who created this, and it's a good addition to everything else. Now, while this story is something that you will actually already read when you're going through Interlude the Vampire, you could possibly read this first. I did. Granted, I already knew the Interlude the Vampire story, but when I went on my journey through this whole saga, I actually started with this one, and was happy to do so. Now, we get into the rest of the books. I'll first tell you my motivation for actually reading them. And essentially what happened was, years after the first film came out, someone who had the rights to the stories came out with the movie The Queen of the Damned. Had a couple good parts in it. I believe it's Aaliyah plays the part of the Queen of the Damned. Did a fantastic job. Very beautiful woman. Every time she was on screen, I thought she was perfect. A lot of the other supporting cast, not so much, but it wasn't their fault entirely. Somebody tried to take the next two books in the saga, which were called The Vampire Lestat and The Queen of the Damned, and the stories are intermingled pretty closely, and make one movie out of it. Now, you're looking at two books whose, total pages was like 600-700 pages. And even if you tried to cram them into a recent movie that's 2.5 hours long, that's not enough time to do so. So they literally took these two books. I'm all washed out here. They took these two books and tried to make something of it. And I believe that their licensing was about to expire, so they just hurried up and got something to the screen while they can still do so. And it just was horrible. So years and years later, I said to myself, listen, I got to read the source documents of this. There's something behind this that they're not telling. They're probably doing no justice to it. In fact, the author Anne Rice herself had said something similar to that effect, where it would rather than just not have made something than to take even something like Queen of the Damned and just ruin it. So I wanted to see for myself, and that's why I went on this little journey. So interestingly enough, as we continue, the Vampire Lestat ends up being all about Lestat, who becomes the protagonist in practically all of the rest of the novels. It's a character with which Anne Rice really loved the most. In an interview, she talked about him being like a seductor, her dark lover, just everything that she's always wanted in a man vampire in her life. So she just wrote about him continually. Well, Vampire Lestat, he wakes up from being in the ground, resting, getting his strength back. Apparently vampires do this from time to time. And he learns that Louis had wrote a book. And he says he didn't even write about him very well, and he kind of corrects that, thinking, hey, if Louis wrote a book, I can write a book. So he does just that. So Vampire Lestat as a book is an autobiography from Lestat that gets published in universe that everyone can read. Now, he also takes along the line of, I'm sick of being in the shadows. I'm sick of people not knowing who I am. So I'm going to be in the limelight. And he hears some music by some garage band, and he goes over there, loves to see these people. They're kind of like gothy people to begin with, so they just look beautiful to him. And he joins the band. The band is actually called the Vampire Lestat, and he starts writing songs, and he sings with a vampire kind of tones as well. And it gets very popular. Albums sell in the millions, and he starts writing stories in his lyrics about the vampires, about what they do, all their secrets, all their history that he knows. Now, interestingly enough, Lestat does not know much about the history of vampires. The vampire who makes him immediately kills himself. So he's in this new world, he has abilities, he's not even sure what they are, but doesn't know the history, so he's trying to find that along the way too. And while he's trying to find his history, he does encounter other vampires who you will see continually throughout the series. But eventually, when he goes to ground and comes out, he wants to be popular. And he comes out, makes videos, makes the music, makes millions of records, and now he's literally just pissing off all the other vampires who want to be secret, who don't want the world to know who they are, because they feel they'll be hunted. They feel the government will come after them and try to find their secrets and everything else. So, that's where this saga all begins when it comes to Lestat. So, the Vampire Lestat book actually segues very well into the next one on the line, which is The Queen of the Damned. So, The Queen of the Damned actually tells more of a story of one of the very first vampires, who's actually been kind of a living statue for centuries. But she's like where she and her husband are where it all began, way back in like ancient Rome, ancient Egypt. And it ended up being a story where they ruled the land, and there was a spirit called a Mel that was kind of poltergeisting around them a little bit. And I understand I'm glossing over this completely 30,000 feet, but as the basics is, there's a spirit out there, and they were kind of put to death, and the spirit enters them, and by entering them, it gave them these like vampiric powers. And then later on, they learn that they can actually like pass that on to others, little fledglings, by taking their blood and giving them their blood, and so on and so forth, and thus create vampires that we kind of know today. It also has that unique ability where if they were to die, it would destroy all vampires. So these were people were asleep for centuries. In fact, there was another vampire called Marius that plays a lot into these stories, who has been keeping them locked away and safe for all these centuries. He actually calls them those who must be kept, and just kind of like worships them and understands their importance, but keeps them away from the mortal world, keeps them away from all their vampires too. Because some are just like, you know something? I want to end it all. Why don't I kill them and we'll end everyone and I'll be happy too. So, you want to make sure that they are sequestered and nothing happens. However, when Lestat starts making music, it kind of awakens the queen. And she loves him and wants to make him a new king. So it has that epic kind of story of saying, listen, come with me. I want to kill like half the men in the world. I want to make a new order. I want you to be my king. I am the queen. Obey me. Yet at the same time, everyone else is like, hey, we don't want her to be awake right now. But what the hell can we do? Because if we do anything against her, it's going to backfire on all of us. So it brings together a lot of all the ancient vampires. They have their epic battle. The ending becomes the ending. I'm trying not to spoil anything here as I tell you the story. And it moves on from there. Now, during this time frame as well, it's very interesting because I found almost like a bibliography of everything that Anne Rice has. And there was a little short story that came up, which I had to go track down. Apparently, she made the short story in Playboy. And the story is, this is from the January 1979 issue, and what the story does is the story takes place almost during the first novel, because Louis finds this vampire named Armand who lives in Paris. In fact, Armand is kind of an actor, and he has this theater company called like the Théâtre des Vampires, also sometimes known as Les Innocents, and they put on vampire stories for the crowd. But the crowd thinks it's all fictitious. However, in the meantime, if they pull someone up on stage, they literally do eviscerate her and drink her blood and everything else, and everyone cheers and waves and, hey, nice show. So the story that she tells in this Playboy issue actually is while they're together and Louis and Armand are talking, Armand kind of shares with Louis the ways that he seduces women. And it goes into a few pages on what they actually call Interlude with the vampire, and just shares a sensuous story, which is kind of befitting for Playboy. I thought it was a nice story, and it was short enough, so I actually did a recording of this. I'll put the link down below in the comments, and if you want to listen to it, so be it. But it was another news story, so I decided to go find it. I picked it up on eBay, and now it was part of the saga I did. Continuing, after the events with the Queen of the Damned, like I said, it took place in both books. That's why the Vampire Lestat and Queen of the Damned kind of go together pretty closely, and that's why I understand they tried to make the movie of them both together instead of splitting it out. We now know who Lestat is. We kind of understand his motivations, and he moves on and starts to do like continuing solo books. And the next couple books are very interesting due to the fact that it's not taking you so far into the lore that you need to have all these additional vampires as a part of this. It's kind of like his own standalone stories. You can read them, even if you just wanted to see what this story, the saga was like, you can just read these individually and not really miss anything. So the first actually ends up being The Tale of the Body Thief. And The Tale of the Body Thief is a simple story where there's a man who actually ends up being kind of a murderer kind of way, or he's a criminal in some fashion, who tracks down Lestat and says, listen, you've been a vampire for hundreds of years. I read your book. I believe your book. I think you might want to be a mortal person for a short period of time. I've discovered a way that I can travel outside of my body, and you can travel outside your body, and we can almost swap bodies. So how would you like to be in my mortal body for like a day? You can eat food and taste what it's like. You can have sensuous pleasures with a woman. You can actually do everything that you can't do now that you're a vampire in a mortal body. And of course, when a day or two is over, come back, we'll just swap the bodies back and move on from there. Well, as predictable as it sounds, when it comes time to swap back, he doesn't want to swap back. He's now in the body of a powerful vampire. Why would he give it up? So now Lestat has to run around in a mortal body and try to find him and get his body back. Along the way, he has more runnings in with this one group called the Talamasca. They've been introduced in this story before. The Talamasca is an interesting organization where it takes a lot of scholarly people, sometimes people that might even have some kind of ESP or other sensory powers, into its conclave, and they watch the supernatural world and they record it. They're essentially Ghostbuster librarians, but they don't go after anything. They don't try to excise demons. They don't try to kill ghouls or anything that's would be hunter-like. They literally are observing and documenting. And they're pretty secretive about it. So there is a man who's a part of this organization who actually is in this story too and assists Lestat in this whole endeavor. Obviously, it's not a spoiler because he's in the rest of the saga. He does get his body back. And for a long time, he's actually trying to convince this man in the Talamasca, I love you, you're fantastic, why don't I make you a vampire? And he's like, no, not necessary. I'm living my life, I'm fine. And then more entails from there as well. So, Tale of the Body Thief, it's a very self-packaged book. You can read it, enjoy the story, no problem. Moving on, we'll go to Memnoch the Devil. With Memnoch, this ends up being like one of the most important books of the saga. It has lasting effects that take place throughout a whole bunch of other stories that occur, even when Lestat's not in the story. So Memnoch is another thing where Lestat's out there, he's trying to hunt this gangster, corporate evildoer kind of person. And just because, he's an immortal, he'll watch him, he'll play with him, he'll not just jump in and go for the kill. And he kind of like sees what's going on with him and almost takes a little bit of pity on him, but eventually does take care of him. But by doing so, he kind of opens up this other aspect of the whole saga where the gangster that he kills comes back to him as a ghost. And not so much haunts him, but you get this kind of feeling that, hey, ghosts exist. they're in this world. They can interact with humans, and depending upon what kind of ghost it is, they might be able to manipulate time and space, or they might actually be able to just give you good information you didn't have that they have now just because they're a spirit. And as a spirit, they have access to other people's memories and timelines and whatnot. But the most important aspect of the book is a devil does make his appearance to Lestat, surprising him because he can't smell him coming, can't hear him coming, can hardly even know he's there when he's there except for what he sees. And the devil says, listen, I got a beef with God. I want you to help me out. I'm going to take you on a tour. We'll go to hell, we'll go to heaven, we'll go to purgatory. We're going to check everything else out. I want you to hear my side of the story. And by doing so, I'm convinced that you will help me against God. Now, he doesn't really believe this, but he's like, fine, I'll go along with it. And Memnoch, true to form, does exactly that. Takes him on a spiritual journey into heaven. He sees what heaven's like, sees God. God even talks to him for a little bit. Then he goes to hell, and he goes to purgatory, and Memnoch even takes him back in time to the Passion, and he sees the physical crucifixion of Christ. And events happen there, too, that literally echo through the rest of the stories. Because Lestat comes out so changed as a person, he's practically catatonic in the middle of a church and doesn't move for days, if not weeks, if not months. It's a very good story, very influential. Again, this ends up being an important book in the saga because of its lasting effects on everyone else. Memnoch the Devil. What's next? Then the books take a little bit of a turn. I'm missing one. Okay. Then what happens is, while Lestat is catatonic on the floor of a church, you get the time to spend time with other vampires. Now, one of the things that Anne Rice had done was she started making these other books that she called the New Tales of Vampires, where it's not about Lestat, it's about other vampires. And she has two such examples here. In fact, they're even a smaller size. One is Pandora, who we see in other books as well. She's back to Roman times, kind of an old vampire. She even has a relationship with that other vampire, Marius, that we talked about during Queen of the Damned. They were lovers for a long time and then drifted apart, and they chase each other over time practically. But you get to hear her story. Now, interestingly enough, when I was trying to go through the timeline, Pandora and Memnoch, I believe, were in the same year they were published. But the events of Memnoch are in the first pages of Pandora. So you know you kind of want to read that one first before you move on to this one. This, again, is one of these members of the Talamasca, who actually now is a vampire, literally finds Pandora in a cafe, sits down, and asks her point blank, can you please tell me your story? She says, fine. She goes back through, talks about her life in the Roman times, talks about how she loved Marius, how she became a vampire, what she's done with that power ever since, and pretty much becomes a very strong female vampire presence throughout the novels. You respect Pandora for her power. You respect her as a being when you read it. Don't want to give out too much of the story, but that's essentially what this book is about, is how she has gone through time in the blood, how she interacted with the world and everything else. Another standalone other Tales of Vampires is Vittorio. This one I surprisingly liked. These books don't have a whole lot of action. And they're not meant to be action books. But again, when you're dealing with vampires, you expect to see, battles and fights and this, that, and the other. And even when vampire fights vampire, maybe they get hurt so much you think they're dead, but of course they're already dead and they come back and yada yada. But no, they're mostly about the relationships of people between each other. And the vampires between each other as well. So there is a lot of conversations about love. In fact, when these vampires meet each other, even when they meet each other for the first time, there's a lot of kissing involved and caressing of the faces and this, that, and the other. They just look at each other through the eyes of love. And that's a lot of pages to talk about love. The action pops up and goes down in very brief spats. This one actually has more than others. I kind of liked it a little bit better for that. And while other characters might pop up in other stories, I don't believe Vittorio shows up again, ever again. Which is a shame, because now you have the history and background of a new vampire. Why don't you use it? Again, artistic license. Also, Lestat, on the floor of a cathedral, completely catatonic, in some state of bliss, torment. It's hard to tell exactly what's going through his mind. You're learning about other ones. This is where Armand gets his own book, where you're introduced to Armand early on in the saga during Interlude with the Vampire, tells the story in Playboy of Interlude with the Vampire, and has more and more happening. There's actually an event at the end of Memnoch that you thought he was gone, and they talk about that here in his own book too. Again, you go through the life and times of Armand, of when he was a boy, that was actually like in Russia, I want to say, living up in a odd family, and then he's sent out to like a monastery, and while he's there, he's painting or creating these statuette type of religious icons, and eventually is sold to slavery, where at the end of it he does encounter Marius, who kind of frees him, makes him join this group of wards that he has around his house, and eventually loves him very much, makes him a vampire, shows him the world, and that eventually will crumble to a certain extent that you already know that Armand ends up in Paris with the Theatre of the Vampires and Les Innocents, and you know his current story from there. But at least you get a bunch of the background of Armand, which you hadn't gotten before. It fills in some gaps, fills in some holes, and shows some of the other vampires coming together and how they know each other and what happens since then. Now, if you're reading this in order, you want to take a small little break. So you've been through the Vampire Chronicles up to this point. Like I said, each one of these books becomes a book in universe that people can actually read, but all the people in the world think that they're all fictional, but they're actually, real. During this time, I guess Sunrise had another idea, and she started writing about witches. Now, the witches and the family of Mayfairs come into play over the course of the next 3 books, almost as if the next 3 books were a different trilogy inside the saga. And you start getting the feeling that actually how they're written is almost like in trilogy form, series after series after series. So, you kind of, if you want to know the background of the Mayfair witches over the next 3 Vampire Chronicles saga, it should be important to actually go through this trilogy. You don't have to, but I do like not having certain spoilers. I do like saying, let me get introduced to these characters in order as they were written, and so on and so forth. It's actually what some people, myself included, that if you ever wanted to show like one of your children the Star Wars saga, I understand that they are in episodes 1 through 9, but they came out, the middle trilogy, the first one, and the last one. And it tells a slightly different story than if you went 1 through 9. So why not do it in the world you knew as it was created chronologically, meaning published date, and it would tell the story in that fashion. That's what I'm trying to get to with the Mayfair Witches, where somewhere in this time frame, when you're talking about all these individual vampires here and there, you can switch bases, go to the Mayfair trilogy, and then come back, because the next couple vampire books have the Mayfairs in them, and they become prominent parts. That being said, let's talk about the Mayfair Witches for a second. It starts with the Witching Hour. This one is a tome. It's about 1,000 pages long. But it's telling the story of 13 generations of a witch family. It goes back to their early days when I believe they're in the old country, or I think it might be Scotland. And there is some kind of spirit that's haunting and assisting the family over time. It always haunts a woman, a witch in the family. And it doesn't just haunt like, hey, I'm coming after you. It helps them out. It'll run out there and get some jewels and bring it back as a gift. And does everything it possibly can to assist the family through life with wealth, with revenge on your enemies, which getting a deal of land or whatever it needs, it will do whatever the witch asks for it, or it will do it on its own and just try to help the family and be very grateful because the family can hear him and interact with him and no one else can. So it takes 13 generations of this Mayfair family, and this thing gets passed down from like the head witch to the head witch in each new generation. And each new generation, that head witch becomes extremely important to the family, and they're even in charge of this financial legacy, which ends up being almost like in the billions by the time we introduce them here in the 80s, 90s. I think she wrote it. And the current incarnation that you're following most of the time is the 13th witch. So that's where all this culmination comes into play. Interestingly enough, when you start going through the story, so many names, so many people. It's almost like when people do George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, there are just so many characters that you can't get them all straight up front. But the good thing is, when they come together for, say, like a wedding or a party or whatever else, and say there's an event that happens in the vestibule where someone tries to shoot someone or someone tries to stab someone, that event is significant enough that it gets revisited 2 or 3 times over the course of the book. Because at different times in the book, you're seeing it from a different point of view because you're telling that cousin's story or that uncle's story or whatever it might be. So, with the refamiliarization of the same event, those characters become more solid and individualistic and distinct in your mind. Which is a very good thing because, again, 13 generations, a lot of names, a lot of events. How do you keep it all track unless you're actually keeping a genealogy and spreadsheet on the side? But overall, this does culminate in a very interesting ending, which is practically the spirit made flesh, which has lasting effects throughout. So this is the beginning of the Mayfair Witches trilogy. And that trilogy actually continues into the next books. The spirit's name actually is Lasher, so that becomes the title of the next one. And now that it's flesh, this is what the family has to deal with afterwards. Lasher actually absconds with the mother, keeps her almost tortured and in chains throughout the story, and everyone's trying to rush to find out where she is, how can we get her back, what happened, you name it. A very family story as far as where the love of each other happens there and how they try to stick together and how they try to fight for each other. It also has some very sad points too. Now it does turn out later on that you learn that Lasher, the spirit, is actually a member of another species. And that species is actually called a Taltos, thus the name of the third book in that trilogy. And the Taltos actually goes more and more into the history of who the Taltos are, what they do, why they are the way they do, so on and so forth. Now, along the lines with this whole trilogy, the Talamasca, that organization we talked about earlier, does play a very significant part in it. Because, like I said, they observe and watch. They've seen supernatural their entire existence. And they've recorded it. Now, there is one member of the Talamasca that plays prominently in this series, whose name is Aaron Leitner. Now, Aaron Leitner, you actually get introduced, I believe, around the time frame of The Tale of the Body Thief. So, reading them in this order, also, you're not seeing the events of characters later that you've learned before. Because when you are introduced to him, you're literally introduced to him. So this book order of reading I find the most beneficial, just because you're not seeing one character before another before you're introduced to them and trying to catch up with how they are. And then when you read the subsequent book, when you're really introduced to them, you're like, wait, I know this guy already. Why are they just introducing him? So the Talamasca plays a very strong part in this, and especially in Taltos, there ends up being a nefarious element within the Talamasca going against almost like what their own precepts are, that also has some lasting effects as it moves on. And that would end that trilogy, but it turns out it's not exactly a full trilogy, because now once she melds all these Mayfairs and the Taltos into the Vampire Chronicles, there ends up being like a fourth and a fifth book that move along with it. And that's actually what happens over the course of the next few books, where you're getting the Mayfairs involved in the Chronicles. And it starts with Merrick. Now, Merrick can almost be considered a standalone as well, because while there is a Mayfair that you hadn't been introduced to before, who becomes very prominent in this, whose name, by the way, is Merrick, you don't have to know much of the history for it. But there's two important aspects why you'd want to get the trilogy out of the way before you read this. Number one, there are things that happen at the end of Taltos that almost become spoilers in the first couple chapters of Merrick. So if you don't want the one to be ruined, it would be important to get at least through Taltos before you read Merrick. Personally, I had read the whole trilogy first before I started the Vampire Chronicles. So it was kind of confusing when they did that introduction to Aaron Leitner. But then later on, when you see him, like, oh wait, chronologically, let me go find out what the publication date, and it made more sense. So if you want to avoid spoilers of Taltos, read Taltos before you read Merrick. And Merrick has its own little solo story. Again, you can read this on your own, because the spoilers wouldn't mean as much to you because you're reading them completely out of order. But once that occurs, then the main characters of the Mayfair trilogy really come into the fore. And Lestat is now being asked to help them out directly. That's when you get into things like Blackwood Farm, Blood and Gold. So this are like books 4 and 5 of the trilogy, and it moves forward. Not too much to say about the stories themselves, I'm sorry about that, but the way they play out is there's more going on within these spirits, and with how the Mayfairs need to get from where they are to where they're going to next, that they need Lestat's help. To give you a short synopsis, in Blackwood Farm, they actually introduce you to one of these Mayfairs that you hadn't heard about before. His name is Tarquin. He actually has this spirit that's been kind of by his side, sometimes tormenting him, sometimes helping him, almost like Lasher was, who he calls Goblin. So Lestat's brought in essentially to assist with this Goblin. How can we get rid of it? How can we cure this? How's this going to happen? And it just kind of gets embroiled in itself. You do have to start out with the usual, like, who this person Tarquin is, who Goblin is, a lot of examples of what they've done and why it is so important to get rid of it in some fashion. As it moves even further, a lot of these characters in the trilogy, in this Blood Canticle book, continue. And now Lestat's actually kind of trying to get it on a little bit with the head Mayfair. Her name is Rowan, who is the latest in the line. But there's actually another one in the line who takes over a real young girl. Her name is Mona. And Mona and Tarquin have a relationship. But in the meantime, she's slowly dying. Young girl, slowly dying. And they find out that there is something to do with the Taltos in the bloodstream of the Mayfairs. And since vampires are all about blood, you get more and more deeper into how are they related to each other, what can they do, and yada yada. Again, more stories of how people love each other, more stories that are, it does become a little bit of a filler, but you get to continue a lot more through it. Now later on then, we start continually talking about other people in the vampire universe, and Blood and Gold does just that. It actually introduces a brand new vampire who's been kind of living in / frozen in ice for hundreds of years. In fact, at one point, he even knew some of the ancient vampires, too, who created him. He's almost like a Viking character. And his name is Thorn. But he comes out, talks to Marius, lives with Marius for a while, tells his story, listens to more of Marius' story, so you get a lot more Marius all over again. And then there ends up being an antagonist that gets kind of dealt with towards the end. The one thing about this book, besides just getting more and more Marius over and over again, that I noticed was it seems like a little about Deus Ex. It's like they created the vampire in a new book just for the purpose of him being the one that does something later on. He ends up being the tool by which the main characters who should have, let's say, their revenge, don't need to get their revenge because this other random guy does it for you. So you get the feelings of revenge, but if there's any repercussions or cost to it, it doesn't have to happen to one of you, my beloved vampires along the way. It's this new guy you don't really care too much about. So it's an aspect of the story that it seemed like he was too much of a tool to be used in this fashion than to actually add something to the story. Obviously, when you hear about new vampires along the way and you get to get to their background, it's interesting because you like hearing about some history from ancient beings told through their eyes as they've experienced it. You're also introduced to a whole bunch of other vampires from back in the day who you never heard of before, who become kind of important later on because Marius, as he's absconding with those who must be kept from one city to another throughout the 100 years of his life, thousands of years of his life, he keeps ending up in different cities, and there might be a vampire presence in the city already, and he has to deal with them. He wants them to merge together, they want to kill him, yada yada, it moves on. Again, I understand I'm going 30,000 feet, completely blown through, no details of the story so much, but just trying to get you a sense of what it's like, and maybe it gets you interested in the book, maybe it doesn't, but I want to give you my feelings along the way. Finally, we have what's considered like the last trilogy story as it happens here. This is one where the vampires have not had a place of their own. They've not had a kingdom, they've not had a court, they've not had a set of rules. It's everyone's kind of going off on their own one by one and just trying to live through the world. And sometimes they do it well, and sometimes they don't do it well. But there's never like, I don't know how to say to put it. It's just one of those things where it does not really go through a community of vampires. And they actually try to start one right here. So here, they think that Lestat, being as important as he is, he's actually got some really ancient blood due to the effects of Queen of the Damned. They got some, what he's gone through with Memnoch. And they say, you should rule us. Or at least come up with a way of us all living together, and if we have problems, we can come to the court and figure it out. So they literally don him as a prince, and now he's got to pretty much deal with politics. I'm sorry to say there's not much to talk about in this book. It almost became forgettable, but it's a lot of that back and forth trying to figure out like how are we actually going to have a vampire land, and how are we going to rule it. So I unfortunately don't think that she ends strong with this trilogy, so we move from there. Now that this is all beginning, and we continue the novels, we get Prince Lestat and the realms of Atlantis. Um, Here we also introduced to another genetic line, a different species of people who actually were around during the time of Atlantis, or as they call it, Atlantia. There is a semblance of aliens in this species, and somewhere between Anne Rice maybe having finally watched Highlander 2 and thinking it's a good idea, or I don't know if she got into Scientology and is now going through the history of L. Ron Hubbard and the space aliens and what have you, but that kind of is how I felt this book was. So it talks about this other species. The other species happens to be where the spirit of Mel, who entered the Queen of the Damned and created the vampires, came from. And you're getting that whole history. There is other areas that this alien beings are kind of helping the world with other kind of technologies and whatnot slowly, but they're also kind of hidden and don't want to be known. But it's, unfortunately to say, it is what it is. Lastly, she ends up. One second. She ends with blood communion, which is now I realize I have a signed copy. I didn't think that existed before, but blood communion really goes into certain kind of politics and actually setting up this court of vampires with which other vampires can come in. Again, you talk more about like how should we do this? Do we have bylaws? What are the rules that we should live by? Like for instance, in a lot of the books they talked about when you take blood from a human, always take it from an evildoer. Don't take it from an innocent person. Take it from someone that you know has done bad. In fact, it's interesting when they actually absorb their blood, some of their memories and feelings come through the vampire in the blood, and they can actually kind of confirm how bad the person was. But they've always talked about always do blood from the evildoer. Well, in Atlantis and now here, sometimes someone has an innocent. Apparently, the innocent blood tastes a lot better. So this court they're putting together is trying to actually make actual rules, and by making the rules, you can actually have sanctions and punishments due to whoever offends on the rules. But they spent a lot of the time doing that. There's another villain in here that was introduced a couple books prior called Rashomon. You get to get his full cycle of villainness as it goes through. So one of the shorter ones of her books. But unfortunately, as you go through this book, again, my own opinion, 250 pages long, the book's done by about page 170. It spends the next 80 pages or so just dealing with people's feelings on how it ended, and it deals with how we're actually going to put the court together. In fact, there ends up being some kind of masquerade ball or just, some party, and all the vampires are there, and everyone's looking at each other with love in their eyes, and isn't he beautiful, and isn't she beautiful, and it's all so fantastic. It just, it lacked a good ending. To me. I'm sure there are people that think this is the best of the bunch. It's the last one that was written, and I commend you for that opinion. Every time we find something we love, it's very important. Cherish it. Hold on to it. But things like this, I was just not very satisfied with this. So, Blood Communion ends up being the end of the saga. I don't know if she has any partial novels set up on the back end that now that she's passed on, someone is going to publish posthumously. I don't know if I would actually read it due to how this ended. It's so bland and blah. It's almost like how I don't know if I'll watch the new Game of Thrones show because the last season of the first show was just so horrible you couldn't go through it. But that's enough said. So I've said my piece. This is the Anne Rice Mayfair Witches and Vampire Chronicles. It was interesting enough to go through. It was an exercise I wasn't sad to do. I had that initial oh my god, this second movie was so bad, I gotta read the source material, to going through everything. But now that I've done such a thing, what I'm planning to do is I'm actually going to sell all this on eBay as one big full set. Unless someone else who might be considered doing this pick this up and read them as I did. But I hope this was some help to you. Right now it's still under an hour, but I'm not going to try to stretch this to an hour. But thank you all for listening. I think I'm almost done. My next episode should be about Jordan Peterson and his 12 rules for life. I'll give you all my opinions of that then. In the meantime, have to always say this, if you did like this, if this is content you want to see more of, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, tag that bell. As these come through, I'll be placing them into their own playlist, and you can actually just see what's going on there. I believe that the next ones will be more detailed in the actual book, because it's not going to be a 20-book summary all at one time. So you'll see more detail and you'll get more opinions and feelings. Otherwise, thank you very much and goodbye.